I'm Kate Livy, the Director of Education and the Associate Curator here at the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum, and I'd like to welcome you back to another installment of Chesapeake Treasure, a feature here on Facebook where we explore one of the 68,000 objects in our collections here at the museum. So today, in honor of the upcoming Christmas holiday, I wanted to do something a little bit holiday themed. And I've done a little research into the origins of a tradition that a lot of people around the Chesapeake and nationally all enjoy on Christmas Eve, and that is oyster stew. So I wanted to pull some of the objects from our collections associated with oyster stew enjoyment and oyster stew preparation, and also talk about the history behind this particular holiday ritual. So oyster stew traditionally, if you looked back into the 18th century in the Chesapeake, wasn't really a thing. I found one of the earliest examples of an oyster stew recipe from 1755 in Hannah Glass's cookbook called The Art of Cookery. And in it, she essentially encourages homemakers to create what's kind of like a hot oyster smoothie. You know, you take oysters, you pound them with a pestle, you add them to oyster liquor, you take the yolks and eggs, you mash those all up, you cook them in the liquor, and you add some mace and you add some pepper. If that doesn't sound too appetizing or even anything like oyster stew, that's because oyster stew is really very much a 19th century concept. You would think it's so simple, we would have started eating it a lot earlier, but it turns out that oyster stew has a lot to do with Irish immigrants. So in the 19th century, during the potato famine, there were millions and millions of Irish immigrants that fled Ireland, coming to America for a new opportunity and a new start. And most of these Irish were also Catholics, of course. Now, there's a tradition in Catholicism that says that before a major holiday, there's a fasting day. A fasting day, you're supposed to go meatless. And so before Christmas Day, that meatless rule stood in, and that meant that the Irish brought over a tradition from Ireland, which was eating a fish stew. Now, they used ling, which was a dried fish, common in Ireland in that time period. Of course, we don't have ling here on the East Coast. So what they ended up substituting instead was something that in the 19th century was widely available in cans as well as fresh, and would have been very affordable because these were typically people who were not the upper classes. So what did that become? Well, that became oyster stew. Now, as you can see, we've got a lantern here, a really wonderful lantern that is advertising oyster stew. So in the 19th century in Baltimore, New York, you know, eating oysters out at restaurants was becoming more and more common. In the 18th century, restaurants were really sort of inns where you can also stay overnight. But in the 19th century, the idea of preparing food or having it prepared for you in these restaurants was becoming more common. So the sign that you see here advertising oyster stew, I think is really wonderful. It has space inside for a lantern, and it would have been on the exterior of an oyster saloon that would have been really just ornately covered in lettering. There tend to be really decorative, you know, these exteriors of these storefronts, because they really want passersby to get hungry thinking about all the delicious seafood that they have inside and come on in and stop by. So the other thing is that, interestingly, lighting had to do with the sort of the reputation of a lot of these oyster saloons. So the darker an oyster saloon, generally the more disreputable. The better lit an oyster saloon, the more sort of above board this oyster saloon would have been. So I love this sign because it's an indicator that, you know, this was a real attractive and inviting way to get people off the street in the winter time to come in and fill their belly with a little bit of warming oyster stew. The oyster stew that they would have been eating in the 19th century is the one that we're familiar with today, where it's mostly oysters and milk. Some people add onions. Later on in the 19th century, people would start adding potatoes to make that broth a little bit more substantial. But it was always considered an appropriate meal to have as you came home from Mass in the evenings, and really started to become a widespread practice. Now, it was often served in bowls and dishes such as these. These came from the Isabel, one of the vessels here in our collection. And you couldn't really have your oyster stew without oyster crackers, which also became synonymous with the dish. So we have some of the containers here for oyster crackers. Now, We believe that oyster crackers were invented in 1848. They were known as a Trenton oyster cracker. But the ones that became really highly popularized were used by the Nabisco Company, or what was then the National Biscuit Company, who started producing a line of crackers that they referred to as oysterettes. So I think you can see as you look at this particular sign or advertising, I mean, it's very colorful, and they want you to know that this is the cracker to have with soup. These, small little hexagonal crackers were actually patented in 1900, which I think is kind of great. And if you've ever visited the restaurant, the Cracker Barrel, well, here's a real example of an actual Cracker Barrel. These were very popular additions to soups and to stews. And so actual barrels of these crackers would have been available for people to buy as a staple when they're shopping for their homes. Really, I mean, you see this tradition moving from the East Coast to the West Coast in the 19th century. And the thing that you should keep in mind, of course, is that that all had to do with oysters that were coming from the Chesapeake. So I have a little can of Stork brand oysters here, one of my particular favorites because of the tongue-in-cheek advertising. But the thing to keep in mind, of course, is that in the 19th century, the Irish immigrants that are moving to the coast are also moving west. They're taking this tradition of oyster stew with them, but the way that they're meeting the demand for the ingredients of oyster stew is because of the huge oyster industry that was producing oysters out of the Chesapeake Bay, canning them, and then shipping them by rail across the country. And the beauty of canned oysters is you can add them just as you would normally in an oyster stew recipe today. These oysters would have been unflavored. They would have been ready to be prepared fresh in your oyster stew. And again, it's a really quick, easy meal for people as they're coming back to trim their tree, to enjoy time with their family, and to celebrate the holiday. So if you are an oyster stew lover and you've never really thought about how your family started to celebrate Christmas with a bowl of oyster stew, now you know it has to do with innovation, it has to do with immigration, it has to do with advertising, and it has to do with a wonderful celebration of a holiday and whose practices we still observe today. So I hope you have enjoyed this very special installment for Christmas-themed Chesapeake Treasure. Please let us know what you think in the comments below, and I hope you all have a very Merry Christmas.